Oh, this is Gamil Grant here with Mayfield, and just really pleased to have our special guest today, Dan Elron. Dan, you're sitting there in your lovely living room there. I really appreciate you taking time. We've known each other a few years. You've got an amazing background at Accenture for many years. I know you're doing advising work these days with a number of other companies. Could you just introduce yourself by way of background and how you came to now where you are today?
Thank you, Gamil. Pleasure to be here. Honored to be asked to participate in your series of podcasts. Yeah, I have been in management consulting for a very long time. Recently retired from Accenture. At Accenture, I drove for many years work in the tech and telecom industries, working a lot with Silicon Valley companies as well as large global enterprises, and then eventually moved to working on Accenture's own strategy, its ecosystem, its relationship with both large providers of technology as well as startups in the focus of Accenture. I recently retired from Accenture, and now I'm working with startups as a mentor, advisor, investors, as well as with the other extreme, very large companies that are struggling to integrate this amazing wave of technology that's coming to us, including the topic today, which is generative AI. But as you can imagine, it's just the tip of the iceberg. There are many other things happening in the next 10 years, I think, not just in IT, but in IT-enabled technologies, including in healthcare, biology, agriculture, et cetera. So there's a lot of interest in good ideas about leveraging technology for strategic value, and I really enjoy working with clients on that topic.
That's great. Well, thank you. Your background, I mean, you've had so many conversations at a strategic level with thought leaders, with major corporate teams. Is there something unique about generative AI or AI specifically that you think means higher priority from a leader standpoint? Meaning, should we be putting more attention to this?
The answer is yes. I'm reminded of Yuval Harari, who wrote the book *Sapiens*.
Yes,
And
yes.
something he said that really struck me. He said, Gen AI means hacking the operating system of humans,
Yes.
because language is the operating system of humans. And if we're hacking that, maybe it's very primitive hacking today, that means that we're affecting a lot of the information flow between humans, a lot of the transaction between humans, and eventually a lot of the emotions between humans. And ultimately, all organizations are made up of humans, and they don't work very well if the humans don't work well with each other and communicate with each other. And here we are introducing a new agent, an automated agent that speaks our language, generates our language, and can help or hinder how
Yes.
an organization works. So because of that, I think it's extremely important. I don't think anybody understands exactly where it's going to go. We're early in the technology. Every month brings something new. And we are fascinated by what's going on today. But if we can, it behooves us to really think about the likely evolution in the next 5 or 10 years. Very difficult to predict, but it is fundamentally disruptive. So the answer to your question, Gamil, is yes, I think it's extremely important. It doesn't necessarily mean that this is where you need to spend the most money as an
Hmm,
enterprise, but
hmm,
probably it means where you need to spend the most thinking as an enterprise.
hmm. Yeah, that's a good way to think about it as well. In a sense, we're not necessarily seeing huge budgets associated with it, but a lot of attention and ideation occurring here. You speak with and advising a number of companies. What are some of the early learnings you think people are sort of achieving, or where are they focusing?
Yeah, I was shocked by the early use cases even a year ago. Very basic things like feeding trouble tickets into a model and reducing the speed of figuring out problems and reducing the level of experience required to address these problems in an enterprise. So very impressive gains very quickly, and not necessarily in the areas that we predicted. That requires experimentation, which I think most folks are doing right now, and it requires creativity. There's a lot of underappreciated sources of knowledge which you can feed into Gen AI. And I make the distinction between Gen AI and the rest of AI, including machine learning. I think these things integrate with each other and need to work together. We can't just focus only on Gen AI. But when you do that, you get amazing results, not necessarily always the most strategic in terms of market positioning, but certainly impactful in terms of speed, cost, as I said, level of talent required to execute a process. So I think the early learnings here are can be transformational for many processes. It requires experimentation. It requires integration, as I said, with other technologies, whether it's AI, specifically machine learning and associated technologies, but also with other technologies. If you're in biotech, it means integrating with the latest learnings in science and in biotech. And that's something that we're beginning to see. And there's an amazing difference between the leaders, companies that have been at this, in this case, for a year or 6 months, and those that are just getting started today. So if you're not doing a lot of that, you're behind. The other lesson learned is, and something that concerns me, a lot of companies, when they think about Gen AI, think about my organization. What should I do? Which department? Is it customer care, chatbots? And they rarely think about the ecosystem as a whole. The supplier, because the suppliers are going to use the same thing, and you can work much better with your suppliers, or sometimes be disintermediated by your suppliers if you don't think about how they're going to use Gen AI. And the same thing with other partners, supply chain partners, government partners, your customers. And a lot of the use cases, I see lists of use cases,
Yes.
are internally focused.
Hmm.
And we need to look outside. Odds are somebody outside our ecosystem will have better ideas than we do, just statistically, in terms of what to do with Gen AI. And in some
Yeah.
cases, if we're not careful, we'll be disrupted because somebody will build a platform and our products, our services will be consumed by some kind of automated agent that they design and they control, and we have to respond. Hopefully that's not going to happen, but in many cases it will happen. So the early concern I have here is you really need a holistic point of view, not just look at your competitors because everybody's doing that, but look at the whole value chain, at how you're delivering value to customers, who's got more power, whose power is going to be amplified by the use of Gen AI, and unfortunately whose power is going to be diminished because we're reducing friction, for example. We're making information more easily available. So the competitive dynamics in many value chains are being disrupted. It's just beginning now. It's going to be accelerated. But the role of the chief strategy officer, if you have one, which maybe wasn't that significant 5 years ago, because of this technology, is really becoming much more significant.
Yeah, I think that's brilliant. The idea of looking at the whole value chain, and you're so right. So many of the use cases that I hear are pretty either just early adoption sort of ideas, which is okay, this is how we're getting started, but narrowly focused internally, focused on a step or function or process that we want to automate or whatever, but it's internal versus the whole value chain. So how do you move a team to begin? You mentioned the chief strategy officer. How do you help set metrics that set an agenda that might provide, I don't know, fodder or material evidence, how to think big here, how to think really creative, how to maybe disrupt stuff? What kind of metrics would you suggest to a CEO, let's say you're meeting with?
Yeah. Before we go there, I think the strategy to implement Gen AI and AI in general, because of what I just said, because it's so potentially strategic, but it's also so important tactically in terms of cost reduction on processes, the strategy has to be driven both top down and bottom up.
Mhm.
The experimentation that you and many others talk about needs to happen. Often it should happen bottom up. I don't like the idea of having a chief AI officer. I know that's a little controversial. I think everybody should be a chief AI officer. Certainly every report to the CEO should, part of their role should be chief AI officers for their domain. It's not something you can delegate. It's the same thing that I think about innovation, by the way.
Yeah.
But in terms of the impacts, the impacts are going to be different. Therefore, the metrics are going to be different between the tactical bottom-up work and the more strategic work. So clearly for the tactical bottom-up work, the classic measures of productivity, which, as I mentioned before, can be extremely significant productivity gains already. Certainly, we see that in software development. I
Yes.
don't need to tell you that, but also in customer service, in repair, trouble ticketing, etc. They're very significant. And here, I would focus less on the ROI because the cost side is still unclear. I think prices are going to come down eventually, and I wouldn't hamper the technology by allocating too much cost to it yet. When that scales, maybe. But for now, I think you want to experiment and introduce it as quickly as possible and not apply the usual business case logic, which slows everything down in many, many companies. I know that's easy to say and CFOs don't like it, but it's early in the technology, and I think that's the right thing to do. Also for the reason that we all know, which is learning. It looks interesting, and there's a lot of value in taking a 2-hour course if you're an executive on AI or Gen AI. There's a lot more value in seeing it actually in your organization working and hopefully working well. In terms of the metrics, I think speed is extremely important because, as we know, speed is strategically valuable in just about any context, not everywhere, but in just about every context. And then also, in terms of, depending on the business process, the number of steps in the business process that are automated versus manual. It's a very basic thing. This is something we looked at in the past when we did re-engineering, for those of you who remember that.
Oh, yeah.
But that will help you understand the ability of your organization to change. Also, how susceptible you are to disruption. If something that you took many steps, it suddenly becomes much more simple with this technology. Maybe your competitors, new entrants can do that with a new platform and overcome the complexity that kept you successful as an incumbent. So some of these metrics are not traditional, but because we're early in the technology, we want to understand the strategic value. I would introduce those. Another one that I find very interesting is the impact on labor experience and training required. We all know there's a shortage of talent. We all know that Gen Z has got different priorities and different requirements in terms of their jobs.
Yep.
So what is the impact in terms of the experience and the training and job satisfaction of introducing this technology? And therefore, what does that mean in terms of your labor demand, the kind of labor, the amount of labor that you're going to need over the next few years? Just to give an example, one case I know of, it's in the automotive industry. The average experience required to solve a particular problem went down from the need to use an engineer with 5 to 7 years experience to engineers with 1 or 2 years of experience because they were enabled by Gen AI. That's extremely powerful.
Huge, powerful.
And in markets like in Europe, where a lot of engineers are retiring, there's a shortage of talent, it's extremely powerful. So that's a metric that typically people don't use, I think is very helpful to consider. And the last metric, which I don't think is what you were asking about, is risk. We tend to attribute too much risk in some cases to AI because of all the press and so forth. What is the real risk here? And what I encourage companies I talk to that are concerned about applying AI is really to measure the risk. What's the worst that can happen? And how often do we have problems? Obviously, it's early in the technology, we'll have problems, but are they showstoppers or are they things that can be managed and fixed?
Yes.
And that helps management overcome the fear that in some cases prevents them from doing anything. Even in a law firm, there are many, many things you can do with Gen AI that are not going to get you in trouble when you get to a judge who doesn't like a brief that you've written. There are many things you can do. And so having a solid, simple framework for saying this is high risk, high reward, this is high reward, low risk, that helps you in the strategy and helps you measure whether you are kind of having a good portfolio in terms of both risk and reward.
Yeah, awesome. You touched on so many examples there, but you come from a management consulting firm for years. How do you think management consulting will evolve through this?
That's a very touchy question. I think management consulting, because it is full of people who an economist called symbolic manipulators, people who work with symbols,
Yeah.
whether the symbols are software or words on the PowerPoint. Um, that industry is going to be perhaps one of the most affected
Hmm,
by this hacking of language
hmm,
that Yuval Harari mentioned. So I think it is potentially one of the most disruptable industries because of this technology.
hmm,
Um, there are still barriers to disruption. It turns out that PowerPoint, for example, is not the best way to train a large language model, but we're going to get there. And so, in my perspective, and this is an industry I spent pretty much all my career in, the industry needs to reinvent itself.
hmm.
The software part, definitely, that's already happening. I just saw various projects where we're using software to develop complex systems, or at least pieces of complex systems that would have cost tens of millions of dollars, that now can be done much faster with talent that's a lot less experience. So it's disruptive there. It's also disruptive in something that the industry does, which is take information, aggregate it, and deliver it in a customized way to a client. So it is an industry that really needs to rethink what it's doing. I know several of the firms are doing that, but it is threatening. And there you get into the psychology. If it is really threatening, sometimes you don't move very fast. And I think that's very dangerous for that industry.
So, what do you think some of the gaps or issues or impediments are for large organizations? I mean, we here in the Valley so much talk about technology all the time, but are often reminded by, large global CIOs, hey, it's a people issue, it's a process issue, it's a change management issue. Where do you think the issues or gaps are?
Well, I'm going to discuss it with you as a venture capital firm. There's a terminology we haven't used for a while, but maybe you've heard of it. It's called the ilities. And
Yeah.
ilities are attributes of technology, especially computer technology, which include scalability, manageability, integrability, security, et cetera, et cetera.
Yep. Yep.
Those are missing for Gen AI.
Mm,
I think we all know that, but I don't think there's enough funding that's going towards these things, which may not be that sexy, but for an enterprise to use this software in a reliable, predictable way, we need a lot of investment in those entities. And hopefully there'll be a lot of solutions that emerge from startups, because startups are much faster sometimes than the big players
mhm.
in addressing these. Another gap that kind of addresses something that I mentioned earlier is really risk mitigation, risk management. We know the technology is far from perfect. We know about hallucinations, but there are very few tools at this point to tell us what is dangerous and what is not dangerous, or to help enterprises figure out where to put the technology and let it run, where to turn up the temperature on a model, where let it be more creative, or use a model that is completely explainable. Not everything has to be explainable. That would be terrible if we required every model to be explainable. I know a lot of companies think they should. I don't agree with that. The places where you can take risks, where creativity is good,
Hmm,
and where, frankly, you don't care whether you know how the answer was received. You
hmm,
probably can tell that the answer was a good one, and the risk of not explaining how you got there is okay.
hmm.
So that's something that's missing as well. The other thing is training and change management, which everybody talks about. I
Right.
know that even an hour of training on using language models has a huge impact on productivity. But what about a day of training? What
Hmm.
about a month of training with mentors who know
Yeah.
this? We
Hmm.
still don't know.
Hmm.
Another gap is the change management. People in many organizations, all the way up to the very top, in many cases, are frozen. They'll say,
Yeah.
yeah, let's have a few pilots here and there. Let's reconvene 6 months from now and see how these pilots
Hmm.
have gone. And I think that's in some cases it's fine, but in many cases it's too slow. And
Mhm.
so, what kind of change management can we put in to encourage departments, product groups that are susceptible to either disruption or have an opportunity to really do much better, generate a lot more revenue? How do we encourage them to be comfortable with the technology and to go not just into exploration, but into production? Here, even examples, case studies, videos, interviews like the one you do can really give confidence to organizations to move faster. And
Mm.
right now, I think many are saying they're moving fast, but when you really look at the rate of implementation and how close they are to getting something into at scale production, the answer is typically is often not very good.
Yeah.
You extrapolate the things that they think could get into production are going to be a year or 2 years away, which is way too long.
So you've helped people get through this change management obstacle many, many times, I'm sure, in your nearly 30-year career at Accenture. How did you break those log jams? I mean, how did you get people fired up?
Well, this is challenging, but yes, I remember even having to convince companies that broadband was a good idea. That ages me a little bit, and here we are with something that probably is much more disruptive than broadband. Fear and greed are very helpful here.
Mm.
If you paint a picture of an ecosystem that's full of agents that decide who should buy what at what price from whom, and you look at your own process and you see how many steps and how bureaucratic what you're doing today is, that creates a degree of fear because your competition could adopt these technologies and be much better, faster, potentially cheaper. The more I read about these competitors to Amazon,
Mm.
the Chinese players,
Yes.
the e-commerce players who are coming into the US and how they're using not Gen AI, to some extent Gen AI, but AI in general or technology in general, and how quickly they're moving, um, that should strike fear into all retailers.
Mm. Mm.
And pretty much other companies as well, maybe even highly regulated, protected companies like insurance,
Yes.
which I know are taking this seriously. So that's one way to address it. Greed, I think we all know how that works. It can be
Yep.
very powerful in the C-suite. The cost reductions, as we mentioned, the reduction in the talent requirements for addressing business processes, the simplification of organizations, the integration of agents, not just today's Gen AI, but what's coming next. When you describe it and provide real examples in a C-suite, you see people's eyes light up. They
Mm.
understand that this will have
Mm.
a bottom line impact on their organizations. And so the biggest concern I have around change management is there's so much negativity about AI right now, especially
Mhm.
in Europe. The concerns about the risks, the amount of regulation, the issues around hallucinations, which could get companies into trouble. That's all true. But I believe that's putting a lot of speed bumps into the
Mm.
exploration and deployment of the technology when they're not necessary.
Yeah. Interesting.
So that's something that needs to be overcome. I mean, these are early days. Competitive advantage often is created in the early days. New models are created by innovators. And in some cases, as we know in technology, being a second or third doesn't work, especially when you look at platform ecosystems, et cetera. This could happen here. Doesn't necessarily have to happen in every industry. But I think having a view on what might happen, having scenarios, and moving quickly when necessary makes a lot of sense.
Dan, you have shared some amazing insights here. Just to bring it to a close, one, I want to thank you so much for your time. Do you have any final parting words you want to offer to, let's say, a C-level executive on how they should be thinking about going forward?
My experience in the last few months, having been in this business for a very long time, is I have never seen a technology that's moving as quickly with the potential impact that it has.
Hmm.
Partially because it's built on top of the internet, a lot of investments, but we're now accelerating. So I struggle myself to imagine what and how quickly things can happen. So that's a message I would leave. It requires really understanding, really thinking about the long term, about how an ecosystem could change, including how you make money. So that's one of the lessons. And again, things change every month,
Yes.
and you need to keep up to speed. Working with the innovators, but also scanning the world. As I mentioned, lots of lessons from China and other places. So that's one. The second thing is don't delegate. Um,
Interesting. Yeah.
as I
Yeah.
said, don't, maybe you need a chief AI officer.
Hmm.
I hopefully, I don't think that's the case, but this is something that every senior business executive needs to take seriously, and think about at least their domain, if not related domains, and how that's going to accelerate as we get into from generating content to autonomous agents, as we discussed.
Hmm.
So the good news, I think, yes, it's a little concerning. It could be disruptive. I think the impact of the technology on things we care about, like healthcare, for example, environment, transportation, are going to be dramatic in the next 10 years. I think our children are going to benefit from this.
Yes.
We need to be careful, but we need to really be inquisitive and excited about what might come.
Yeah. Time to be curious and own the opportunity, right? Well, Dan, thank you so much. Dan Elron, special guest speaker here today, longstanding senior leader, managing director, led innovation and strategy at Accenture for nearly 30 years, now advising companies. Really honored to have you as a special guest today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gamil.